How well does the first human heart transplant operation of that fateful December 3, 1967 compare with similar operations today?
The anesthetic time was 1 o'clock in the morning, and the clock up there has been set just before 6 when the new heart started beating. Some people think this was done at 1 o'clock in the morning because it was a big secret, but it's not so at all. It just took many hours to get everything ready, and as soon as they were ready they had to start. Because if they left it much longer, the donor would have died and they wouldn't have had to been able to use that heart. So that's why they started at 1. Present day transplants take about the same time. In total they were actually busy for 8.5 to 9 hours, and that's more or less what they take now in total as well. A little bit shorter maybe, but it's not much longer than today's transplants. Once the patient's heart had been removed, and Barnard looked down into the patient's open chest, he said this was the most awesome moment. He said he saw something that nobody had ever seen before in their life before. This was a living man with no heart, and he knew there was no going back. He knew he had to put this new heart in Mr. Washkansky's chest. And he said he never felt so lonely before, because there was nobody he could turn to and say, you know, what must I do next? He just had to go and put that new heart in. And the other very awesome moment was when they eventually got the new heart to start beating. There was applause from several doctors watching. And later on, we have on film where Barnard is actually in tears, where he describes that moment. He said it previously it was that it had been dark, and when the new heart started beating, it was as if a light had come on. And that was really quite awesome, because they really didn't know if that new heart would start beating or not. They had no idea. And the surgeons shook hands over Mr. Washkansky's chest. They were so excited, and they were saying, it's going to work, it's going to work. They were very happy that that heart had started beating.
What a great start it was for the man who had shocked the world by accepting a procedure whereby he was going to be living with the heart of another human being, a young girl of 25, killed in her prime by a drunk driver.
It was 8:30 a.m. when Mr. Washkansky was eventually wheeled out of the theatre, first into the recovery room, and then to the intensive care ward, which is upstairs. They had to put him into a sterile lift, and of course our intensive care ward was sterilized. His bed and bedding, everything was sterilized. The staff were all tested to make sure they didn't have infections, and of course everybody had to wear sterilized clothing. By 9:10, we have it on record that he was fully conscious and moving his limbs, but he couldn't speak because of the tubes in his throat. But 12 hours later, they removed the tubes, and he could speak, and he said to Barnard, wow, I feel wonderful. What kind of operation did I have? You said you were giving me a new heart. He didn't quite understand it. He'd signed the forms to say he would have the transplant, but he didn't quite understand it. And Barnard said, well, that's what I did. I gave you a new heart. I did very well for about 10 days. He could even get out of bed and walk across the room to look out of the window and sit in his chair. He had visitors, his close family and the rabbi and the mayor of Cape Town.
While Dr. Christian Barnard and his team came back to the hospital the next day, December 4, to immortalize those moments of success, the news has spread around the world like wildfire. The Cape Town Times was on the scoop with updates on the situation of the man whose smile, following the successful operation, hit the four corners of the globe. But what the Barnard team considered a landmark event was in fact dividing public opinion around the world. This museum holds thousands of letters, telegrams, photographs, drawings, newspaper cuttings, and volumes of wise sayings. Many are a testimony to the polarization of public opinion aroused by the first human heart transplant. Some of the objections raised then may sound ridiculous at best today. But remember that in the 1960s, organ donation was unheard of and consequently an abomination.
For many centuries, the heart was always seen as something very
Sacred.
yes, sacred and mystical, romantic. You know, the heart is the symbol of love, and it's the seat of your emotions and so on. And it was just unthinkable to many people that one could live with somebody else's heart. And when Barnard was questioned about all of this, he said, what nonsense, there's nothing mysterious or romantic about the heart. The heart's just a pump. It's just a piece of muscle, and it's just there to pump blood around the body.
The flowers on the grave of the first heart transplant patient, Louis Washkansky, who lived for only 18 days, had hardly withered when Dr. Philip Barnard Bleiberg, the second patient to undergo a heart transplant at Grootersky Hospital, came knocking at the Barnard Theatre, much to the consternation of his detractors. In fact, the man who came up with the most immediate response to Dr. Christian Barnard's medical challenge, as they perceived it, was New York-based Dr. Adrian Kantrowitz. He ultimately gave up after he registered rather dismal results in his own human heart transplant operations.
The second heart transplant in the world was performed 3 days after the operation on Washkansky by Barnard, and this was done by Mr. Adrian Kantrowitz in New York. He operated on a small baby who only lived for 5 hours. He did 2 more after that, and not another one. He just gave up because all 3 his transplants were a failure.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Those were the emotion-packed words of Neil Armstrong, the first man to set foot on the moon in 1969. Like the first lunar landing, Christian Barnard's first human heart transplant in 1967 is an epic story of no less importance. To many, its contribution in extending the frontiers of human imagination and possibility is unique.
When one looks at the press coverage of the first human heart transplant, some people say that it in fact captured the imagination of the people of the world even more than the first landing of the man on the moon. The significance of the first human heart transplant lies in the fact that it was in fact done in Africa, where nothing much is often expected by the people of the rest of the world. And even Africans themselves don't expect much of themselves. So I think this particular event should be an inspiration to us all, even people working in Africa doing medical science, to begin to think and to dream that we can do miracles. We should not allow our historic and geographic position to limit our dreams.
The title of Dr. Christian Barnard's favorite poem is "It's All in the State of the Mind." One of his most renowned quotes, and one which is clearly drawn from the substance of that poem, is, "The hunger, you have it or you don't." May each one who comes across this story or visits Heart of Cape Town Museum be inspired by those words and be touched by the Barnard philosophy, daring for a good cause.